Thanks, Jim. Thanks for that introduction, and good evening, everybody. It's great to know that so many well-known companies want to talk seriously about social issues. But from a mutual and cooperative point of view, there seems to be a basic problem. Are companies allowed to prioritise social issues? Or to put it another way, can companies cooperate? I work with a think tank called Mutuo, which was set up by the large mutual organisations about 10 years ago to promote the mutual sector and their way of doing business. And as we see it, the problem for companies is that they are designed and set up to maximise shareholder value. And this makes it difficult for them to promote other social or public values. The problems are the doctrine of shareholder primacy and the duty of directors to promote the success of the company for the benefit of the members as a whole. Basically, people set up companies to make money. That's the corporate purpose. Now, the cooperative model has a completely different starting point, and if we're really going to get into the heart of this debate, we just need to unpack that a bit. The people who set up the first co-ops weren't commercial entrepreneurs, they weren't promoters, commercial promoters, and they weren't investors. They were hungry. They wanted access to uncontaminated food at fair prices, and the market was failing them. But they realized that if they pooled their need for food and basic provisions, they could create what we would today call a sustainable business. If they were loyal to their little local cooperative store, they could buy directly from producers, sell to themselves without adding an owner's profit, and basically achieve fair trade. Clearly, income needed to exceed expenditure. It's the same rules, otherwise they'd go bust. So they needed to make a profit, but they didn't exist to make a profit. They existed to provide goods and services for which they needed to be profitable. Now, these were self-help organisations, and like the other big mutuals, the friendly societies, the building societies and the mutual insurers, it was people within communities that set them up. So they were democratic organisations, bottom-up organisations, and individuals were members, and they elected their board, one member, one vote, and the board usually appointed a manager to run the business. They had no external shareholders, and there was no government subsidy. And it didn't rely on any kind of charitable giving. These weren't philanthropic organisations. These businesses were the original fair traders. They existed simply to provide goods and services without exploitation. They were today what we would call social enterprises. They traded for a social purpose, not for private benefit. But how did this business model work? Well, they got their capital from their members. These were the days before high street financial services. And the co-op was a safe place to store your cash, which was otherwise at risk at home when you were out at work. It was a form of withdrawable share capital, so it was accessible to members when they needed it. Co-ops paid a level of interest on share capital, but it was minimal, if any. What happened was that at the end of the year, the surplus that the business didn't need was either used to bring benefits to members in the form of early day social services, access to newspapers and books, that sort of thing, or it was distributed back to members and customers in proportion to what they'd bought. If you like, a price adjustment post facto, reflecting the fact that they'd been overcharged in the first place. What drove these businesses was not the market, but their members. If I didn't like the goods on display or the opening time of my store, then as a member, my role was to go and talk to my elected representative, to go to a members' meeting, or ultimately get elected myself and change things. So members and customers were engaged and they were loyal. They had a clear interest in the business succeeding, and they exercised their interest. They were active as members, and it was a highly successful business model. But if it was such a great idea, what went wrong? Well, in a nutshell, the creation of the welfare state swept aside a lot of mutual and community-based provision. The rise of the large supermarkets, the PLCs in the 60s, 70s and 80s, the co-ops couldn't compete with that. They couldn't offer the same remuneration to executives with share options, and they lost their way. and 70% of the building society movement was demutualized. By the 1980s and 1990s, the very idea of collaboration within communities and mutual self-help all sounded a bit old-fashioned, a bit Dad's Army. This was the age of individualism, personal ambition, and the pursuit of our own success. And as you'll remember, at this time, there was no such thing as society. And in a sense, she was right. But 10 years on, it all feels very different. Certainly, the big mutuals have got their act together, and their offer has improved enormously. We've had a decade of the creation of new mutuals, and government policy now supporting the creation of new mutuals in the context of public service reform has really changed the agenda. They're popular and people are talking about them again. But let's come back to my question. Can companies cooperate? Well, of course they can, up to a point. They can do more or less anything, providing it promotes the success of the company. But the problem is that pursuing social objectives can only be a means to an end. You can have regard to employees, to the environment and the local community, but shareholder primacy is still what rules. And a legal model which specifically seeks to deliver value to investors is bound to push costs onto other shoulders, the negative externalities, as the economists call them. The very nature of company share capital requires them to behave in this way. And as a result, the statute books are full of legislation since the Industrial Revolution, where Parliament has had to intervene to protect the interests of employees, of customers, of the general public, and, of course, more recently, of the environment. This makes it difficult for companies to build real trust with the public. People know that the priority is profitability, and they know that the priority is the private interests of shareholders. And they know that it's investors who own companies and that employees, customers, and the general public don't. Now, I'm not seeking to demonize PLCs and make out mutual organizations as saintly paragons of public spiritedness. What we're talking about is the underlying business model. It's no accident that women were able to vote in mutuals long before they had the popular vote, that co-ops pioneered the introduction of the 8-hour working day and the minimum wage years before it was a legal requirement. They're designed to be cooperative. That's their corporate purpose. It's in their structure, their principles of trading, and their culture. But they haven't got it all right by any stretch of the imagination, and they're radically reinventing themselves to meet today's challenges, and they've still got a long way to go. But mutuals are also, at £100 billion of turnover per annum, only part of the UK economy. But they're better placed to give a voice and to promote the interests of other parts of society, and ultimately to trade for a public purpose. They're designed to cooperate. Companies are not. So if companies want to cooperate, then they need to become cooperatives. Thank you.